Thanks everyone for joining us. It's about 2 minutes after the hour. Dr. Culpepper with the WSSA, would you like to get us started?
Thank you so much, Eric. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Weed Science Society of America and USDA's Agricultural Research Service today. My name is Stanley Culpepper and I'm your current WSSA president. About a year ago, Dr. Steve Young and Steve Duke submitted a request to the WSSA board to hold a symposium at our annual meeting this past February, which was supposed to be in Canada. As all you members of the WSSA understand, we had to pivot to a virtual platform, which prevented us from sharing our symposiums. So throughout the year, our goal is to provide those symposiums through webinars, and the first one really begins today. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Steve Young. He is a weed scientist and national program leader for weeds and invasive pests at ARS. Prior to his current position, he was a faculty member at the University of Nebraska, Cornell University, and most recently, Utah State University. Steve, thank you so much for joining us, buddy.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate the opportunity to moderate this webinar series. So for those of you joining online, welcome to the first of 10 webinar series that are going to happen weekly over the next couple of months. So hopefully you've seen the emails, you've seen the announcements, and you've kind of tuned in to what's going to be offered. First of all, I'd like to just thank the speakers who are going to be presenting each week. They've made a lot of sacrifices to provide the latest information on the weed science that they're doing at their respective locations. So I'd like to thank them. But before we get started, I want to have a word from our Associate Administrator, Dr. Steve Kappas. So he's got a recorded presentation that I want to share with everyone, so bear with me.
Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Stephen Kappas, Associate Administrator for the USDA Agricultural Research Service. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the USDA ARS and Weed Science Society of America webinar series, focusing on current research and advancement in managing weeds and invasive plants. ARS is one of the leaders in weed science research, covering topics ranging from the development and use of integrated weed management to basic studies associated with the biological resistance of desirable plant communities and herbicide resistance of several of the most troublesome weedy and invasive plants. ARS weed scientists work in a range of agriculture and natural ecosystems that include agronomic and horticultural crops, pastures, forests, wildlands, wetlands, and riparian areas. Through a strong partnership with academia, state agencies, private industry, and numerous federal programs such as BLM, NRCS, and USGS, ARS weed scientists have made contributions to discoveries in the newest fields of robotics and genetics, as well as the traditional and fundamental subjects of competition, physiology, and integration of weed control tactics. In cropping systems, we've been conducting research on herbicide resistance and interference, which are two of the most challenging weed management issues impacting cropping systems across the United States. ARS is a leader in advancing herbicide resistance research, which is highlighted by a team that is now detailed for the first time the molecular mechanism involved in resistance by Palmer amaranth, a widespread and difficult to control weed in corn, cotton, soybeans, and many other crops. ARS scientists are conducting cutting-edge research on chemosensory detection by using transcriptomics to better understand the ability of crops to detect and respond negatively to weeds that interfere with early season growth and development. In non-crop systems, we know that wildfire and management of invasive annual grasses are a major challenge for range land managers across the United States. Research led by ARS scientists is at the forefront of efforts focusing on breaking the invasive annual grass fire cycle. Weed science at ARS has a long history, and many important contributions have been and continue to be made in this field. This webinar series showcases ARS weed science and provides an opportunity for all to learn and be reminded of the value of the agency's work on weed science and how much potential there is for strengthening existing collaboration and developing new collaborations. ARS weed scientists are pushing the field towards more sustainable practices that support economies, protect the environment, and maintain societal well-being. Now, please join me in learning more in the first of the mini webinar series that they have developed for us. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to get started today, and we're going to be kind of kicking things off with a look at the past, present, and maybe some thoughts about the future of weed science at ARS. And so in order to do that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Duke, and he's going to talk to us about the past and the current weed science at ARS. And Dr. Duke received his PhD in botany in 1975, after which he joined the Southern Weed Science Lab in Stoneville, Mississippi. And then he spent the next 21 years there, eventually becoming the lab director. He then moved to Oxford, Mississippi, where he was the research leader of a natural products group. A major project of that group has been the use of natural products to manage weeds. He retired from ARS at the beginning of 2020, taking a part-time position at the National Center for Natural Products Research, an institute in the University of Mississippi School of Pharmacy. Steve has almost 500 peer-reviewed papers, mostly on weed science and related topics. He's been president of the Southern Weed Science Society, WSSA, International Weed Science Society, and the International Allelopathy Society, as well as a chair of the Agrochemicals Division of American Chemical Society. He's a fellow of WSSA, ACS, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's one of 2 weed scientists in the USDA ARS Hall of Fame, and he will receive the Sterling B. Hendricks Memorial Lecture Award later this year, the only weed scientist to receive this award. He's been editor-in-chief of Pest Management Science for more than 10 years, and his main research interests have been natural products for weed management and almost anything related to herbicides, especially their modes of action and mechanisms of resistance. So without any more, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm going to preface this by saying if there are any old timers watching this, some of this is from memory, and I may not have remembered things exactly right, but I did check with a couple of other old timers on some of my facts. So I was a plant physiologist who became a weed scientist very quickly after I joined USDA. As Steve mentioned, I came from Duke University to the Southern Weed Science Laboratory in Stoneville, Mississippi. I came there as a National Research Council postdoc and became a permanent scientist, or what USDA calls a Category 1 research scientist in 1976. I was there going from a bench scientist to lab director over 21 years. And then, as Steve mentioned, I moved to Oxford, Mississippi to head up the Natural Products Utilization Research Unit. Let's get to the history. The first, as far as I know, the first national program leader for weed science in ARS was Warren Shaw, who was in that position when I became a USDA employee.
Hey,
And as
Steve,
far as I know,
Steve, can I
Warren
interrupt
was,
you? Can I
Yes.
interrupt you? Are you sharing your slides?
I think I am.
You need to. You aren't. So let's get those shared.
How, okay. I'm not sure where
Yeah, just like before, the share and then pick identify your screen.
well, I can't find the taskbar. Show taskbar.
Yeah, hover over the Zoom box. It should show up on the
Well, I
bottom.
don't have a Zoom box right now. Let me see. And I'm afraid to close anything down. Yeah, there we go. The Zoom box. Where do I?
Just where you're seeing me and yourself. There should be along the bottom. It should say share screen.
I have a bar, but it doesn't say share screen. Let's see. More share. Oh, okay. When I hit more, okay, share screen.
Yep,
Can you
and
see
then-
it now?
Yep, and then put it in presenter mode. Just push the.
Okay.
Yep.
You can tell I'm an old timer.
It happens to all of us. There you go. You're good.
Okay. So Warren was the first national program leader for weed science, and he was a very enthusiastic weed scientist. He was followed by Larry Christie in 1986, who was a plant scientist who became a weed scientist and remains one to this day, I would say. Joe Antonini came from BASF, and he and Larry were back and forth being NPL for weed science. Joe was a weed scientist, and they were taking turns being NPL and running a narcotic plant eradication lab in Beltsville. After they left ARS, Ernie Delphos, an entomologist who had worked on biocontrol of weeds with insects, I believe in Australia, was NPL for a while. And he was replaced after he went to Michigan State to become chair of entomology. John Lydon, who was a weed scientist, who started out as a physiological plant ecologist, but soon became a weed scientist when he entered ARS at the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. And he was in that position until he had an untimely accident. And he was replaced by Rosalind James, an entomologist, and Steve Young has replaced her. She moved on to another administrative job, and Steve is a weed scientist. So over a period of almost 50 years, we've had 7 national program leaders for weed science. Very often there were fairly long periods between these different people. During those periods, people from the field were asked to come in and be acting national program leaders at headquarters, people like Krishna Reddy, I did it once, etc. I called Larry Christie the second NPL person. He's still around. Larry had worked for Monsanto in charge of their plant growth regulator division, which they shut down, and he came to work for USDA as the weed science NPL, and then he moved on from USDA to work for a small weed biocontrol company, and then he became a private consultant in weed science, which he still does to this day. So he did the NPL job for about 10 years, playing tag team with Joe Antonini. And he remembers that he had annual budget for weed science of about $16 million, which is about 42 million today, spread over 35 locations in the US and a little bit in France. He was probably trying to make me feel good by telling me that the weed lab in Stoneville was the most productive in terms of dollars per publication. Most of the research that was being done back then when he was in the job was related to herbicides, but there was a desire to phase out some of the herbicide work. And back in those days, there was quite a bit of industry interaction with USDA, ARS in their weed science research. This is my recollection of where weed science research was being done. And this may not be entirely accurate, but some of these locations do not have weed science research anymore. And there are locations now that were not doing weed science research back then. But you can see this pretty much jives with Larry Christie's recollection, because there are about 35 locations here. You'll notice there are 3 stars that are larger than the others. One is Fargo, where there would seem to be more people involved in weed science related research. Stoneville and Beltsville, those were kind of the hubs of focuses of a lot of research. What was being done at Fargo there is very different than what's being done now. Back in those days, they were heavily involved in herbicide metabolism, and some of the world authorities were located in Fargo. As Steve and I mentioned, I was in the Southern Weed Science Laboratory, and at its peak, it was the largest weed science laboratory in the world outside of industry. There may have been certainly more people working on weed related projects in industry, but as far as the public sector goes, this was the largest. At that time, we had biocontrol of weeds with pathogens and insects, field weed management, weed biology and ecology, environmental fate of herbicides, mode of action of herbicides, mechanisms of resistance to herbicides, herbicide and mycoherbicide formulation and application technology. And we did do some narcotic plant management work there that was funded by DEA. At that time, it was fairly secret that we were doing that. We had up to 16 permanent full-time scientists in the lab, which included weed scientists, plant biologists of various types, entomologists, plant pathologists, chemists, microbiologists, soil scientists, and 1 engineer. So it was quite a diverse group of people, all working on various aspects of weed management. Nothing quite like it in the world, except perhaps in Begbroke, England. They had the Weed Research Organization there, which was not quite as big in terms of number of scientists. It was federal research like USDA, and it was canned by Maggie Thatcher in 1985, and the people were spread to the winds, mostly fired. So they lost out fairly early in the game. Over the years, the Southern Weed Science Laboratory got downsized. Chuck Swanson was the first director, but he was there for less than a year, I believe. Chester McWhorter was the person who was my mentor and who really built up the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. And then I followed him as director. When I left in 1996, it became the Southern Weed Science Research Unit, which was technically a little smaller. Martin Locke was the research leader. And then when he left to head up a laboratory, a sedimentation laboratory here in Oxford, which was not weed science related, it became the Crop Production Systems Research Unit, headed up by Krishna Reddy. And Krishna had been part of the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. He was hired there many years ago. Krishna still is head of that research unit to these days. So you can see that weed science got downsized considerably there at that location. Frank Forcella, who is, I'm calling a guru of non-chemical weed management. He was hired by Warren Shaw back in 1985, just before Warren stepped down as NPL. He wrote an article for Pest Management Science that was published in 2003, which was entitled USDA Research on Pest Biology Weeds. And in that article, there's this figure which shows a number of scientists who had something to do with weeds in their project. And you can see there were quite a few, with Mississippi having the most, mainly due to the, at that time, the Southern Weed Science Research Unit, but also a few people working in some other research units there. Beltsville had the second largest number, but there were, at that time, there were 130 scientists whose projects had something to do with weeds or weed management. Recognition to weed scientists in ARS is some indication of the status. It was mentioned that I'm a member of the ARS Hall of Fame. There are 2 weed scientists, Chester McQuarter and I were both elected to that status. There are over 100 scientists that have been elected to that for that award over 36 years that they've given it. 6 entomologists and 5 plant pathologists have won that award. And that's proportionately probably about right. There are quite a few more entomologists in ARS than there are weed scientists, and quite a few more plant pathologists. So we've done fairly well there, even though there are only 2 of us that have won that award. The highest ranking weed scientist in ARS over the years was Judy St. John. She essentially had Steve Kappa's job, the administrator that spoke to you at the beginning of this presentation. Judy started out doing research on mode of action of carotenoid synthesis inhibitor herbicides. And she was the guru of these phytoene desaturase inhibitor type herbicides. Another measure of the importance of weed science in ARS is how well it's been recognized by the Weed Science Society of America. If we look at ARS WSSA presidents, back in the 60s, Warren Shaw, the first weed science NPL, was president in the 60s. Chuck Swanson, the first director of the Southern Weed Science Laboratory, was president. So was McQuarter, the second director of the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. Gene Dawson, who was at Prosser, Washington, was president of WSSA. I'm not sure we have a weed scientist at Prosser anymore. We might. Joe Antonini, that I mentioned, was an NPL. He was a president of WSSA. Alex Ogg, who was a weed scientist at Colorado State University. And then that's actually how I looked in 1996. I was president back in the 90s. And Dale Shaner was the last ARS president of WSSA. And Dale had actually spent a lot of his career with industry with the American Cyanamid Company. And then he went to work for for ARS around the year 2000. And he was president of WSSA 2006 to 2008. So, but none since then. As far as research awards over the years, the first ARS person to win the research award was Don Moreland, who was in Raleigh, North Carolina. He did some of the early mode of action work on PS2 inhibitors, very well known for that. Phil Kearney won the award. Phil was a guru of metabolic fate, or the environmental fate of herbicides in the environment. Jim Hilton was a great mode of action person on PDS inhibitors. McQuarter, who I've mentioned, Ellis Hauser at Tifton Georgia, Roy Smith in Stuttgart, Arkansas, who was a world authority on weed control in rice. Richard Shimabukuro, who was at Fargo, he was a world authority on herbicide metabolism. Lloyd Wax from University of Illinois, who was at the University of Illinois. Me, Ed Schweitzer, who was at Colorado State University. Ed Stoller at Illinois. Bob Hoagland, Southern Weed Science Laboratory. I mentioned Frank Forcella in Morris, Minnesota. Kevin Vaughn at the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. Krishna Reddy, Southern Weed Science Laboratory. Dale Shaner at Fort Collins, and then Frank Dion, who is here in the lab here in Oxford. So, but you can see that there was a lot of impact in the first few years of that award, but not so much in recent years. Some accomplishments that ARS has made in weed science, and I may have missed some of the big ones because I really over the years didn't keep track of all of the accomplishment. ARS has discovered several modes of action and mechanisms of resistance. We discovered the mode of action of indithol, for instance. We developed methods for illicit drug plant management in South America. In fact, ARS came up with the methods that are used for Athroxylum coca destruction in South America. Many types of improved weed management technology. McWhorter was very big in that area. We discovered quite a few weed biocontrol organisms. There was one spinoff company from one of the discoveries. Unfortunately, that product never made it to the market, but I think about $15 million got spent on it. Classical inoculative biocontrol of alligator weed with a flea beetle was very successful in Florida, at least for a while. Nothing lasts forever. There were other aquatic weed management methods that were developed by people like Lars Anderson at Davis, California. ARS developed a rapid diagnostics method for detection of glyphosate-resistant weeds. This was Dale Shaner when he was at Fort Collins. Much of the early understanding of environmental fate of herbicides was done by ARS. Phil Kearney and Don Kaufman at Beltsville were the real gurus of this area back in the 60s and 70s. And as I mentioned, Fargo did some of the best work in the world in this area. Much of the early understanding of herbicide metabolism by plants. Advances in sustainable weed management. The Ropewick herbicide applicator was actually patented by a scientist in the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. These are modern examples of that tool that was patented by Jim Dale in 1983. And in those days, the government could not give a company exclusive rights to the patent. As a matter of fact, if the government held the patent, everybody could use the patent. But this is simple technology that did not require huge investment. So the patent was a freebie. We were getting mail bags full of mail every day to Jim asking for plans for Ropewick applicators, and he was sending them. Our postage costs were enormous, sending out plans for making these. They're still sold and still used, but before Roundup Ready crops hit the market, this is the device farmers used to apply glyphosate to any weeds that were taller than the crop. Some personal observations. Glyphosate-resistant crops made some administrators think that there was much less need for weed management research. A very high-level scientist in ARS once told me, well, it looks like we've got everything solved. I'm not sure that there's much need for weed science research anymore. But with the advent and you can see with the advent of glyphosate resistant crops, glyphosate use went sky high. The value of the herbicide market was reduced 50%. Industry reduced research in herbicides dramatically. Universities stopped hiring weed scientists, and when weed scientists retired, they were often replaced by non-weed scientists. So there was a great deal of attrition in academia and government. But ARS may have been affected more by this trend than academia as supported by the apparent dwindling of ARS in WSSA by my analysis. ARS funds the sort of long-term high-risk research that can significantly impact big problems in weed management, such as herbicide-resistant weeds, weed management for organic farmers, invasive weeds in natural areas, and herbicide risk reduction. So ARS has a capacity to form multidisciplinary teams to attack big weed management problems, which is what we were doing when we had that large group of multidisciplinary scientists working at the Southern Weed Science Laboratory. More interaction between ARS weed scientists would be beneficial. Such interactions diminished considerably during my 44 years with ARS. Regarding what's happening now, there's a 2-year planning process for new projects, starting with stakeholder input, action plan development by the national program staff, plus scientists from the field, writing of project plans that fulfill the objectives of the action plan, peer review of those plans by people from outside of ARS to make sure that the quality of the research projects are good. And once approved, funding is provided to begin the project. When research begins, there are annual reports yearly and a final report at the end of the 5-year project. 2 years before the final report, you start the cycle again with this process that I gave here for planning. On oversight of ARS research, national program staff looks over the projects. Office of Scientific Quality Review handles review of the projects. The individual scientist who is either a lead scientist or a scientist within the project answers to the research leader, who answers to a laboratory director in some cases, who answers to a center director, and an area office looks over the whole thing. So there are a lot of different levels of review. And then the scientists are evaluated every 3 to 5 years, depending on their grade, by a research position evaluation panel that's totally independent of all this other. These are the areas where the area directors are in control. So we have a lot of different levels of oversight, all looking for different things. 2 years before I retired, we started the process to compile the 2020 through 25 NP 304 crop protection and quarantine action plan, which contains pretty much all the weed science research that's done by ARS. This is the mission statement you see here, and you can look this up online. In addition to weed science, this action plan contains systematics and identification of pests, insect and mite control, and post-harvest management of crop protection. So it's a pretty broad document. The weed science anticipated products fall in 3 main categories: new weed management technology discovery and development. I won't read all these, but it's pretty varied and ambitious, but these are the anticipated products. Biological control and ecosystem research. Again, a very ambitious set of anticipated products of the research. And integrated approaches to weed management, which is a very long, I put that on 2 slides. And all of these projects are, there are about 75 of them located at 25 locations. The states that are in color have weed science related projects, and that's where we are now. I'd like to thank Frank Forcella for jogging my memory about some of this. Frank just got an honorary doctorate earlier this year at a Spanish university for his work in non-herbicide weed management. And Larry Christie, you can see him here getting an award for he was a sailboat racer for many years out of Annapolis, Maryland. And as I said, Larry's still a consultant in the area of weed science, and he's still doing quite well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That was great. Nice trip down memory lane, if you will. And I think it really helps to kind of give us an understanding of how we've gotten to where we are in ARS weed science. And so I think I want to take the next step and say, well, perhaps what does the future look like in ARS weed science? So I'm going to go ahead and if you could stop sharing.
I'm not sure where the toolbar is. Pause share, is that the right?
Yeah, just go stop sharing on the top of your screen. You should be able
I
to.
didn't, nothing says stop sharing. Oh, stop video, chat, Q&A, new share.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's look at the what perhaps the future might hold. So let me go ahead and bring this up. And so I've been here for about a little over 1.5 years in this position, and as Steve said, a weed scientist in this position, but actually I cover in some invasive pests as well. So while my focus is on weeds, I'm also I oversee some entomology research and some other things like that. So, but I'd like to just share a little bit about my vision for the future of weed science at ARS. And this is really a result of many conversations that I've had with researchers, the extensive and continuous flow of literature, and a lot of my own experiences that's taken me through a lot of different parts of the country. So my vision does not cover every single aspect, and it lacks much of the detail that most conducting research are familiar with. It's more of a high-level look at where ARS weed science might go. I emphasize might, considering many of the current challenges and those on the horizon. So the question is, what are the challenges? And I don't think this is going to surprise many of you, because we've been dealing with these for as long as Steve's been in this, and probably longer. But the challenges right now are really, number one, we've got invasive plants. That's, if you're working in natural systems, if you're working anywhere in that arena, that the emphasis is to slow the spread of invasive plants, and ideally we'd like to stop them. In our cropping systems, it's managing resistance, whether that's resistance to herbicide, whether it's resistance to a practice. We're trying to overcome that resistance to whatever we're trying to employ to try to control the weeds. So overcoming that, as well as developing new and enhancing existing tools for sustainable management. So that's really the emphasis of all our research, is how do we advance management practices, because we're not there yet. And we see that in many of our systems that we're working in, that we need new tools or we need to enhance existing ones. So some of the key research areas that I see, as areas to address as far as weed science and ARS, and this I think really connects as well to academia and to other groups that are working on weed science. Number one, or I guess one of the areas, is weed genomics. And we can talk about this probably for many hours. We don't need to do that at this point, other than to say there's weeds that are very problematic, and sequencing those genomes is currently underway. There's about 19 that have been done to some degree. But we're addressing this whole issue of adaptation, evolution, and then with, we've got epigenetics and gene editing. And so these kinds of areas are what, is a potential area to look at. And I got this figure that I thought was really relevant, especially when we talk about stress. And I'll get to that in a minute as far as, abiotic stress. But when stress is imposed on various weeds, weed species, they've shown that there's a really nice kind of a, understanding or a look at how that affects crop improvement, how it affects weed management, and also looking at plant biology. So some of the things that we're considering, or that is being considered, is adaptation of stress response mechanisms employed by weeds for crop improvement, the function in weed genomes in comparison to those of model species, and the broad tolerance of stress by weeds and invasive plants that have little genetic variation. So those kinds of areas are really ripe for some investigation. If we look at what I call plant ecology, this is a very broad field, but things like phenology, morphology, plant competition, seedling emergence. I could list many more on this slide. I just picked a few, but I think there's some really, kind of fundamental areas to look at as far as plant ecology. And so I got another figure that I think really highlights this as far as what do we need to do, especially with the impact of climate variability. So they've really depicted this very nicely in showing that the past, when there was less variability, perhaps fewer tools. But now, as we go into the future, this emphasis on a variation in our approaches, in the things that we're looking at, is becoming even more and more important. And not just in cropping systems, but also in natural areas. We talk about restoration success. So recognizing and leveraging interspecific variation and local adaptation. That's in a paper by Boffman et al. In 2022. And being able to adopt these changes when the evidence is clear. So it's understanding what's happening and then acting on that. And in a lot of ways, it's looking at this diversification of our practices. So this plant biology area really kind of, I think, highlights that. And the last one that I'm going to put in here is this application technology. And as I was talking to Steve earlier this week, this field is advancing so rapidly that it's hardly possible to keep up with it. I have trouble myself, but I think it's a really important area, especially when we talk about what we can do as far as monitoring systems, whether it's sensors, cameras, computer technology, and then actually making applications using robotics, UAS, remote sensing. And so, we did a paper back in 2017 to kind of show that where technology can move us is perhaps to more of a true integrated weed management approach, where you have all the tools available at one time in a very precise way. And so there's a lot to that. I know there's a lot of pieces there. And not only is it the technology, but it's also the human dimension aspect of, is the equipment available? Is it affordable? Is it going to be adopted? Those kinds of questions go along with that. And I'll touch on that here in a minute as well. So this is another area that I think is really prime for research and moving us forward. So when we talk about research frameworks, there's all types. I'm sure many of you are working with these, and about these, but I just put this out as a, kind of a capturing kind of this weed genomics, application technology, plant ecology. Everything is interrelated around weed science. Okay. And so if we're going to add to that, what are weed scientists in ARS also collaborating? So they're not just doing this independently. They're working with stakeholders. They're working with organizations. You heard about Steve talk about, needs assessment. So contributing to weed science that way. Companies, industry, there's a role for them to play in contributing to this process as well. And then finally, it also included is academia, institutions that are also doing research. Many of these strong research partners of ARS is something that the agency is known for. And I think, what Steve said about over his period of time, he's seen less and less, interaction. I think that could change. And I think there's a way to kind of help move that along. So when we talk about this framework, then we think about, so what do we run past this? What do we run through this? Well, if we wanted to talk about one individual weed, we could look at the various aspects, whether it's genomics, ecology, application technology, okay? Next, we can look at populations, whether that's looking at certain characteristics or perhaps functional groups. So is there a population that we want to know more about? And finally, we're looking at entire systems. And Steve gave the example of the Southern Weed Science Lab was very integrated across disciplines. And I think we can do that again. And I know that happens, as we speak, but that's really the way that we're going to address these bigger questions. And as you see the circles being added, that means the questions are more complex and the answers are more challenging. And that means we need more expertise. Oh, and if you were asking about the external factors, throw onto that things like climate change or anything that goes along with that, whether it's extreme drought, flooding, you put that over it. And I just gave the example here of the connection might be to weed genomics. Maybe there's a, back to the stress response question. If we overlay economics, so we're always interested in how much things cost, what is the expense here? And that's really where maybe there's an application technology piece there. And you want to know, farmer adoption, are they going to do it based on cost? And then the last one is plant ecology. Okay, so acceptance, you could also substitute adoption in there. These practices, they work. We know that, the research shows that, but are they going to be adopted? Are they going to be accepted? And so I think there's where there's this kind of social piece that is important to include as well. So there's a myriad of connections that could be made between external factors, key research areas, but it depends on location, interest, and need. So I'm just going to finish up. This is my last graph, my last figure. I want to show that, as Steve showed, here's the kind of administrative areas across ARS, across the country. And just emphasizing this, focusing on slowing the spread, overcoming weed resistance, as well as developing new and enhancing existing tools for sustainable management. So if we're trying to build capacity, what is currently there? And so I've posted, or I've shown with these red stars, these are existing location where weed science research is occurring. And you're going to actually hear from individuals at each of these locations over the next 9 weeks. So you're going to hear anything from restoration to herbicide resistance to invasive plants, biocontrol. You're going to hear something from these folks over the next couple of weeks. As well, we have other locations that are doing weed science research as well. So we've got a few others. And then I've also like to point out that we have some new SYs coming on that are fairly recent, or they're going to be starting soon at these other ARS locations. So their research and these weed scientists, they're looking at weed genomics, plant ecology, application technology. So all of them are working to develop new tools while enhancing existing ones to improve management of weeds. So like I said, you're going to have a chance to hear from these folks, and I would highly encourage you to do that. I think it'll be a really exciting time to listen to the latest research, what they're working on, as well as how they're partnering with their different stakeholders and different collaborations. So that's all I have to share. I know we've got a few minutes for some Q&A, so I'll just open it up. And if you want to ask a question, or if you have something that you want to share with us, please go ahead and use the chat box or the Q&A. I think you can post a question in there. So I'm not seeing any questions, and I know this is probably the big picture, so maybe it's not as pressing as far as questions, but I think there's a really great opportunity here to kind of move weed science, back to maybe addressing these issues that it once did, years ago. But I'm looking forward to that opportunity. So anything, Steve, that you want to finish up with, or you want to mention while we've got time?
Not really. Certainly, there's some huge needs out there that need solving by the whole weed science community, including ARS. And those great needs mean great opportunities. So I wish I were starting over again.
Yeah. Well, and I see it looks like a question from Mathula about how is collaboration between USDA and ARS scientists done in the past? I think it's, I don't know if that's confusion between USDA and ARS. I mean, ARS is part of USDA. Maybe I'm not interpreting that question quite right. There's another one. What can WSSA do to help your efforts? Support. I think supporting our weed scientists, collaborating, showing there's this connection between ARS weed scientists, university, industry. I think that's really the key here. And actually, WSSA has played a big role right now in supporting this webinar series. That's been a really important support mechanism as well. So a lot of appreciation for that too. How will ARS prioritize where they will place new weed scientists? It's a great question. So we have a process where each unit decides, what they need, what's important, and based on their interaction with stakeholders, and then they come up with priorities. If a weed scientist is at the top, they'll pursue that. There's also other ways to bring in new weed scientists as well, but a lot of it comes from stakeholders, advocating for, what they need to have done, and then we work in partnership with them. See, what is the outlook for even more new weed scientists in ARS? I'm optimistic. I look at the glass as half full, not half empty. So like I showed you, there's 3 new weed scientists coming on, which is exciting. And I'd like to see, I think we'd like to see more, that's a great sign. So it's really exciting to see new weed scientists. Where's the Weed Science Hall of Fame? In Maryland or DC? Steve, do you know that one?
Oh, I'm not sure where it is now. At one time, it was out at the visitor center out past Bark East. But I'm not sure where it is now.
If you come, I'll take you there. If you want to come I'll give you a personal tour. How's that? All right. Says presentations be shared. Yes. So this is all being recorded. So after this is done, it'll be posted, and then you can view it afterwards. You have any comments for young researchers about how best to prepare for work in these challenges? Great question. So be optimistic. Be optimistic about what's happening. And yes, there are challenges. Yes, they look daunting. But I think with a lot of the expertise that we have, Steve shared that. He shared a great example of what it was like, with the Southern Weed Sciences Lab in the past. And I think in the future, there's that opportunity. Maybe it looks different. Maybe it's across an agency, maybe it's across locations, across, academia, industry. I think that still exists. So I would say, be optimistic and be prepared for that opportunity when it comes along, because you never know.
I agree. And one thing I'd like to emphasize for the young scientist, you can't really make much progress by yourself. You need to find good collaborators, whether they're within your own organization or with whatever organization. But I've probably published with almost 1,000 other scientists, and you really need to find the right collaborators to really get your teeth into some of these big questions out there.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, we've got a few minutes, so I'm gonna, I don't see any more pressing questions, but thank you all in the audience for engaging with us. This has really been fun to do. And I'm looking forward to next week. So same time, same place. We're gonna hear on integrated weed management from Dr. Marty Williams. So he's gonna be talking to us about that. So I encourage you to join us and share this with others, get the word out. It's really, I think, going to be a great opportunity as we go along. So thank you everyone for participating, and look forward to seeing you next week.